I knocked on the door of King TV, a cold call, and got an interview with the news director. I was sitting in his office and he said, I see you went to Northwestern. Did you major in journalism? I said, no. I just learned how to write. And he said, well, what makes you think you're qualified to be in this newsroom, to be in television news? And I said, I'm curious about everything. And so that was enough to get an audition a week later. And a week after that, I was hired, one of the first 3 women in television news in a room full of 100 and plus men who didn't want us there, by the way. So that's how I got started. I was a woman in the right place at the right time. That's why I got the job. I was young, I was pretty, I had a good figure, and I was blonde. And I'm telling you, there was no woman in the business the equivalent of any of the men in the room. They hired pretty young women. But that's how.
And you were talented as hell.
Well,
which didn't take long to surface.
No, but they didn't know that. And that's what's so germane to some of our storytelling, because we had to go in grateful. You had mentioned that, Elaine, in one of our earlier conversations. Yeah. We had to be grateful that we were there, and that made us subservient. And I'm still angry about that. So, Elaine, tell us your story of how you got into the business.
Well, I wanted to be a sports reporter. This was 4 or 5 years after Julie was a king. And I'd worked a summer internship in Bakersfield in, I think, 76. And I did sports on the 11 o'clock news. I reported during the day. I shot, I edited, those days and I'm glad I had all those experiences. And then after I got off at 11:30, I went to Buck Owens' radio station and recorded sports commentaries for the next morning. And I was young and cute and blonde, and Buck would chase me around the radio station and call me his little filly.
What? Oh my God.
Luckily, I ran faster. And, but, it was, Julie and I talked about this the other day, and it was like we were, everybody's work wife. I mean, you had to play the game, acquiesce. Mm-hmm. So I decided after Bakersfield, I had this little tape. Well, it wasn't little in those days. It was a 3/4, but I had all these tapes, and I knew I couldn't send them out and say, I want to be a sports reporter. So I hit the road, and Julie knows, no sense of direction. I literally went to the auto club. They gave me one of those idiot maps, and I said, I want to drive cross country, look for work. And so they said, well, okay, took a magic marker, and Seattle, which I knew nothing about, was the first place. I thought I'd go and down the coast and over and up and across back. Called my father, said, will you fund this? He goes, yeah, I will, but not for forever. So we have to touch base. He said, I know you. You could do this for a year and be perfectly happy. So I drove to Seattle and got there at night, didn't know where to stay, went to a motel that said Seattle Center. Turned out that was almost walking distance to all 3 stations. Had a couple contacts at Como and Cairo. Had meetings there, and then called King cold. And Norm Heffron said, come in. And he took me to dinner with Gene Anderson that night. He said, call me before you leave tomorrow, because I was going to Portland on my, as I promised my father, a schedule. And Norm, so I called Norm, and I just thought he was going to give me the contact of the Portland station, who was part of the King group. And he goes, do you have time for lunch? And now I think I'm a charity case, because he's, so I said, that's so sweet, but I really want to get to Portland so I can make phone calls. And he went, like he did.
That's what he
and
did.
He said, I was going to offer you a job. And I said, I could do lunch then. Yeah. That was it.
Yeah.
I started the next day. And I was the first woman, one of the first in the country, but the
Yeah.
first in that market. Yeah, by far.
Absolutely. And I remember when they hired you, I'd been a reporter there for what year was that, Elaine, when you got there?
I think it was
70.
January of 77.
Right. So I'd been there for 5 years and I was already raising hell and, becoming a thorn in management's side, but something I would continue to do throughout my career. But um, I remember when they hired you, the newsroom was stunned. Just, I mean, really, not
And it's
only
hard to stun a newsroom, as
it's
we
hard to
all
stun a
know.
newsroom, exactly. But people were shocked, and especially in sports. I mean,
Yeah.
even the three women in the newsroom, I remember feeling, oh my God, thinking, you know, I was excited about it because here comes another woman in the room. Um, and I was ecstatic, and we bonded pretty quickly, didn't
Yeah.
we? Yeah, we
A
we
matter
did.
of days, I think. But
Yeah.
when the main sports guy heard that I was being hired while I was at this lunch, and he called the restaurant and got Norm on the phone and said, if you hire a woman to do sports, we will become a laughing stock. They didn't like him. He was talented, but he was difficult. And they just said, not your call. So then I had to go into the room and meet him. And I don't, you're fearless when you're a kid, I think. And I walked in and said, look, you don't have to like me, but I'm here to do a job. I'm going to try really hard to do it. We don't need to be friends. It'd be nice if we were colleagues and coexisted peacefully, but that's your call, not mine. So if you want to be an asshole, knock yourself out, but you're not going to scare me.
He was good at that, though. I must say.
And I walked out, and I'm sure I was shaking, but he totally turned around, took me to a then Seattle Supersonic game that night, introduced me to the media. I mean, who knows what he said behind my back, but we became friends.
Yeah.
So,
No, it was an amazing time, and that made four women in the newsroom. At that time, Elaine and I are good friends, and we've stayed good friends for a long time now, all these decades later. But we did share, and I know this is a universal, or at least in the United States, but probably universal truth, that women coming into the professions owned and operated by men, we were not welcomed. I remember that we had to, as I said earlier, play a game with them and pretend to be subservient with them, and go along with the story assignments that they gave us, which were not the hard news stories, although Elaine may have had a different experience in sports. But let's talk a little bit, Elaine, about what we talked about a few days ago about having to be uh, uh, cooperative and grateful, that feeling of that we had to be grateful to be in the world of men. And it still infuriates me all these years later. I don't think that much has changed, actually. But
and I was entering a world of,
testosterone men.
yeah. So it was, it was the beginning of the locker room thing. And, that entire sports community had never had to deal with that.
But Seattle welcomed you.
They
Seattle,
did.
they
And
welcomed
you know
you.
what? But I played the game.
Yeah.
I didn't, say, it's my job to be here. I deserve to be here.
No.
In a perfect world, that's true. In a fair world. But I knew I had to earn their respect. So I just took my time. I said to the coaches, the players, figure out what you want me to do so I don't miss deadlines. I think it was Sonic season then. And they said, well, why don't you come out, tell the PR director, then Rick Welts, who you want, he'll come out, you can do it outside the locker room. I said, fine. It was always about access. It was never about being in a locker room. And I just was missing deadlines because other reporters, print reporters, would stop them on the way out. So I said to Lenny, I talked to the guys, and by then I knew them all, but I said, I'm missing deadlines. We have to figure something out. And the guys said, you know what, it's changing. There are women in other cities now, women photographers. Just have her come in next game.
When you talk about Lenny, you're talking about Lenny Wilkins, the coach of the
Yes, Lenny
Sonics.
Wilkins was coaching the Sonics then.
Right.
And so the first night I went into the Sonics locker room, they had a little ceremony for me. They were all in matching robes. They gave me a tour. You know, in those days, they had beer in the locker room after games. They gave me a beer, a tour. They look like a Sears ad in these little wrapped robes, and made it a whole thing. And, they're 12-year-olds, those guys. They play a game, and you've just got to go with the humor. And I was lucky. I don't think the audience was as quick to accept me, but once they see their sports heroes accepting you, and they do too.
They took their cues from you. I was in the news part of the newsroom. Elaine's in sports, but we of course became good friends back then. But I remember having to fight very hard to get some of the lead stories and not just be sent to cover, bake sales at elementary schools. Seriously, I mean, and the horrifying truth for both Robin Groth and me back in the early 1970s, our entree into hard news came from Ted Bundy. When Ted Bundy started his killing spree here in Seattle, the men in the room didn't want to cover it. They did not want to interview the parents of the victims, who were all University of Washington students. And the guys, these big, strong men, didn't want anything to do with that. But Robin and I did. And we stepped forward to cover those terrible crimes. And that put us in a different light, so that the men in the room had to view us in a slightly different way. But still, in the interior of the newsroom, the day-to-day operation of the newsroom, and I don't know, I'm sure Elaine experienced this too. There was so much sexual harassment in the room. There was no word in the vernacular of sexual harassment. That phrase did not exist in 1970s. But we were grabbed in the ass. We were sort of taunted every day. One, Don McGaffin, an investigative journalist there, would grab me by my breasts pretty much regularly. And we had no recourse. There was nothing we could do. And Robin and I think a couple of the other women, I know I made this pact with myself to ignore that. Just give me the lead story. So you're playing this role, you have to compromise yourself. That would never be tolerated today. But back in the day, when you're the first of anything, and in 1972, Robin Groth and I were among the first women in television news in the United States. So there are no rules. There were no rules for the men. There were no rules for the women. We had to make it up as we went along. And that's what Elaine was doing too. And you remember.
And I think it helped. It really made, and I always hate when people say, women can be so competitive and bitchy, and
well, we can.
We really stood up, bonded together, stood up for each other. And that really helped us to survive and excel, because you always had that.
Yeah, you do. We did.
And
we
that
did
was
stick
critical.
Together. Yeah, it was critical. One of the ironies for me back in the King broadcasting days in the 1970s, this station was owned by a woman.
Yeah.
Dorothy Bullitt was the first woman in the United States to own a television station. And she used to come down to the newsroom on a daily basis. I'm sure Elaine remembers this. She came down all the time to check on her girls. And she garnered the respect she was due. And she brought us up to her fourth, fifth floor offices from time to time and invited us to her home for dinner on Capitol Hill in North Seattle to
She
see how
also
we were.
served us the strongest eggnog
Oh, yeah.
I've ever had in my life for the
She,
holidays.
she used to spike the eggnog at Christmas parties,
Big
but
time.
she was something, and a role model to certainly the women in the room and the men too, because what she did, despite gender, was to inculcate in all of us uh, the reality that we were there to serve the people of the Puget Sound. That was our job. She said, "It's good to be first, but better to be right." And then she said, "It's best to be first and right." She meant if you made an error in your reporting, if you had misnamed someone, if you had made any kind of journalistic screw up, you had to go and fix it. You had to not apologize, but clear it up.
And she also walked the walk, because
Yeah.
when there was a family scandal
Oh,
with her very well-known family, she came down to the newsroom,
yeah.
and for a fleeting second, forgetting who she was, we said, "Uh-oh, she's going to tell us not to cover this," and she did the opposite. She said, "By the way, you not only will cover it, you
Yeah.
better get it first and get it right."
Right. That was her mantra. But she was
Yeah.
talking about the death of her grandson, correct? That was when he drowned in Lake Washington under some very suspicious circumstances. And we had to cover it. It was, and we did. We had, we made a lot of good enemies. We went after people who were prominent. She never, ever, ever tried to interfere with the covering news. And the advertising department, by the way, I know this is necessarily what we're talking about, but we're talking about the days when journalism prevailed, really true good journalism. And the advertising department was not allowed into the newsroom. None of the ad people were allowed to come into the newsroom ever. So we could socialize with them in the cafeteria and at the Christmas parties when we all got drunk on her eggnog, but they were not allowed. So there's a real border barrier, which she regarded the newsroom as sacrosanct. And then, as women, I think I'm trying to remember how I felt back in 1972, 73. I remember my first job at King in 1972. I was an intern. I was on the air 4 months later when there was a lot of resignations of reporters, but I was making $8,000 a year in 1972. And I suspect we were not paid as much. I do not know. I can't even answer that question. Elaine, were you, there were no other women? Yeah.
5-6 years later, I think I was paid 30,000 a year.
Yeah.
But, she picked, I mean, I agree with what you said, but she did, made sure that the editorial content was up to the standards she demanded, but she didn't interfere with things.
The daily
she hired people to run the room.
Right.
And I think if she wasn't happy about that, she had them deal with it.
Right.
She didn't deal with the day-to-day. She
No.
didn't deal with the minutia or specifics.
No.
So I doubt that, I don't know, she probably saw the budget, God knows.
I don't think so. She really
maybe
was
not.
hands-off
Yeah.
with the day-to-day operation. She hired good people and expected them to do their job.
Yeah.
I remember some years later, when my salary started to go up, and I don't think we ever really openly discussed salaries among the reporters. But
Wow.
I was the new reporter, so I didn't have any notion of what was comparable or fair or what the equal pay would have been. I do remember 5 or 6 years later, I went in to negotiate my contract, my pay raise, and I went in and I put a price tag on my lapel of my jacket. And you have to be willing to bail. If you're going to play hardball with men in charge, they were all men in charge back in the day. I went in with I think a $35,000 or $40,000 price tag. I literally got a price tag and put it on the lapel of my jacket. And the news director said, what the hell is that? And I said, that's my fee. That's what it's going to cost to keep me here. And he laughed and he said, that's not possible. I said, well, I'll turn in my resignation by the end of today. Well, I got that salary. I learned how to play hardball with in an era when there were no rules for how to play ball with the boys.
And that was hard to do then.
It was very hard to do, but as you said, Elaine, when you're young, you're pretty fearless. And I was still in my late 20s then. And I had just won 2 Emmys for the station at the age of 29. And I had a story that ran on the Today Show nationally and garnered huge response. And they also had learned that the head of CBS, Eric Ober, flew out to Seattle to interview me for a job on 60 Minutes. He had seen the story that aired on the Today Show, 16 minutes uncut on a history, a whole documentary about a killer here in Seattle. And I'd become obsessed with it anyway. We strung it together. The news director sent it to his friend, to Tom Brokaw, who was his friend in New York, and they decided to run the piece. Well, that helped me in my negotiations. So I made the decision not to take the job at 60 Minutes because I just had a baby and I didn't want to live in an airplane. But, so be it. I never regretted that decision. They did not know what to do with me. I think I was one of the first pregnant reporters allowed to be on television showing my belly. The management didn't want me to do stand-ups anymore because they didn't want to show my pregnancy. And so I fought that too. I was also the shop steward at the time. So they already didn't like me for being a union person. And then they didn't like me for being pregnant. How dare I? And then I had the audacity to ask for maternity leave. So all of that is conflating and converging at the age of 29, 30 for me. I just always managed to find chaos wherever I went. But anyway, I did get the maternity leave. The after local union got 90 days maternity leave in the summer of 76 after Jeremy was born. And then I had to deal with all the guilt of finding daycare for a 3-month-old and going back to work. And that was all new. I was the first woman around here to do it. And one of the first in the country, I would later learn, but managed to get maternity leave in the local AFTRA contract and eventually helped it get into the national AFTRA contract. So the men didn't like it. They didn't like it. Anyway, it was a time. It was a time. And,
and it was
Elaine and I
also fun.
God,
it was
so
kind
great.
of
Yes.
the Wild West.
Yes.
And we were fearless. We were tough. We, fought the battles. We joined together.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of fond memories of those days. And
me too. Yeah, it wasn't fun. It wasn't just oppressive. It wasn't just unfair. It wasn't just sexist or sexual harassment every day. It was a lot. We had a great time. We really did.
And I think because and partially because we had each other, but, we've survived it, we excelled. And so then, that stuff, it just becomes less important because, and you gain the confidence. I mean, I left Seattle and went to LA.
Yeah.
And that was a much bigger sports market. There was a whole new host of people to meet. And, they'd had 1 or 2 women, but they were that briefly, and then they were out of the market. So it was kind of like starting over again. But with the confidence that I gained from Seattle.
And Elaine and I want to say Elaine and I anchored the weekend news together for a couple of years with Jeff Renner, the incredible meteorologist. The 3 of us had a great time. Elaine and I had an amazing experience anchoring the news together, and occasionally got in trouble for what we did. But you tell the we had so much fun. That needs to be said too, as we complain about some of the difficulties we faced. In hindsight, we were pioneers. We got a great opportunity. We were the first girls in television news, among the first in the country, and certainly here in Seattle. So it was a great gift, despite some of the hardships, which we overcame. But Elaine and I, oh my God, the fun we had on the Saturday night newscast right before Saturday Night Live.
Julie, we got that call from the ratings people. What was our share?
Oh, it was like
It was one of the
biggest shares
largest
in the
ever
country.
recorded.
Yeah, we were garnering what, an 80% share, but we had a great time, and the weekend shift was a little freer. I will say, I will tell another story involving Elaine and Jeff Renner,
Okay.
sitting on either side of me. At the end of every newscast, you do what's called a kicker story. You know, just you guys know that, something light. And this was a story about a sinkhole in Winter Park, Florida. And it's only funny because it only engulfed a couple of Porsches and some other expensive cars. No one was injured, but it swallowed some cars. And then Elaine and Jeff, unbeknownst to me, when we came back to the 3-shot to say goodnight and coming up next is Saturday Night Live, Elaine and Jeff sank in their chairs and went down so you couldn't see them anymore.
In perfect unison, I'm proud of that still to this day.
My God. And I was like, what the hell are you doing? And it was funny. It was funny. The news director was not happy with us.
Yeah, nor was Sturholm. Remember, Sturholm was on the phone before we got upstairs.
He was on the phone wanting to speak to us. I said, for once, it wasn't my idea. So that was fun. So we had a great time. And I think we broke a lot of ground. We didn't have a lot of people ahead of us to show us the way, but we figured out the way. I was fired because I was a pain in the ass to management. That I happened to be a woman, honestly, was secondary. I was well known. I was like 12, 14 years into my career when this catastrophe happened. And I was put out because they needed to sacrifice somebody. I was literally a sacrificial lamb because some of the police wanted blood. And the fact that I was female, honestly, was secondary. But I was but it was part of the issue there. I was a woman. I was considered a troublemaker. I was a shop steward. I had been disagreeing with management about pretty much everything. And so they wanted to put somebody, and I was well known at the time. In 1987 was when this horror happened. Actually, yeah, the firing was in 86. So yeah, I was fired for being a problem they wanted to solve. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for me, they broke 14 union violations. They could have done it with intelligence, but they did it with such utter stupidity that it went to trial. And the judge wrote a 53-page excoriating opinion against King TV, and I went back to work. So that's another whole, it's chapter 33.
Well, I got fired in, I think it was 82. So I'd been there 7 years. They wanted to bring someone else in. And I didn't get along with the news director at the time. But
who was the news director? Steinle?
Steinle, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Who was my next door neighbor, which was also present.
Did you? Oh God.
So I was on my way to do a story. I mean, I knew that things were difficult. And what we didn't know is that Steinle had hired someone who was from that area, was working in Sacramento at the time, and told him not to tell anyone. You know, he'd gotten the job, I think. Well, maybe that was McMackins. Anyway, for me, I'm on my way to do a story. And happened to be an exclusive that I'd gotten with one of the Sonics about some news thing. And they call me back to the station. And I come back and I have a phone call, and it's the credit union. And they say, how do you want us to handle your car payments? And I said, well, $300 a month, same as they have been. They said, no, do you want us to take the whole amount out of your last check? And I said, I don't understand what you're talking about. And they said, we were told to prepare your last check. And so I went, really? So I went up to Steinley's office, and he was gone. And Carol, the newsroom secretary, called him back. And then he was all nervous and knew he'd screwed this up, and fired me. And so the thing of it was, the next morning in the newspaper, there's a banner headline in the PI in the sports section saying Perkins fired by credit union. It made national news in some places, here's a way to get fired. So it was just nuts. And then there was such a backlash against Steinley because it had been publicized how badly he handled it. And I'd been there 5.5 years, I guess.
Yeah, the newsroom, we were pretty upset for you. And later, after you were gone, the newsroom was pretty upset on my behalf too. But I want to say, Elaine and I are thinking, this is a good place to sort of announce this. Elaine and I, for years, have been talking about writing a book called Pink Slip about people getting fired. I think of all the professions I've ever heard of, television news and radio too has a really bad history of firing people, men and women. But I think, Elaine's story is, well, we both have good stories. So we're going to put out a national call for people to send us their stories.
One of my favorites, and I'll tell it quickly, and it was a sportscaster in Arizona, and he was driving to work, and he would always pass a billboard with the anchor team on it, Action 7 News or whatever, and they were scraping his image off the billboard and putting he pulled over and they're putting someone else on it. Got to work and said, no. And they said, oh yeah, news director wants to see you. So, yeah.
Was I fired because I was a woman? That was part of it. It was definitely part of it. I think had it been a male, they never would have perceived some of the men making trouble. They would say, well, they're just trying to help us. It's how you view where's the criticism and commentary coming from. So I was viewed as an unwelcome female voice, and that all bled into the ultimate decision. Here's a good chance for us to get rid of her.
And they also didn't expect you as a woman to fight back.
That's
like they might have expected a man.
That's why I said, who do you think you're dealing with? They had seen me do all these incredibly aggressive stories. And, I dealt with the mob. I dealt with murderers and serial killers. I mean, who did they think they were dealing with? So I marveled at their stupidity and how they handled the whole thing. So it was a difficult and wonderful year at the same time.
Remember when we had lunch at the market? That may have been the last time I visited Seattle.
Yeah.
You, me, Robin.
Oh, and Linda Gist.
Linda Gist.
Yeah.
Remember the table next to us?
No, what happened?
They leaned over and said, we're loud and telling stories
really?
and tales. And
us?
Oh, I know, shocking. And said, we miss the kind of journalism you guys used to bring to us on TV. We were trained to never be the story. I mean, we didn't.
Right.
We did stand-ups when it made sense. If I was covering a team on the road, they wanted to make sure they knew I was in Milwaukee with whatever team. Then I'd do a stand-up. But I never did a stand-up to do a stand-up. And we were trained, you are not the story. And I think now the news people have become such celebrities that they're the story.
The advent of cable has changed everything. The technology has changed everything. we, as Elaine said, we were not in it to be on it. We were in it to report to the citizens in the areas where we lived what was going on in their communities. And it was our job to do that and do whatever we had to do to get the story. So yeah, everything changes. Maybe it will go back someday, but it is depressing, especially given the dark times in which we now find ourselves. Be fearless, stand up for yourselves, especially, women and men, but you have an obligation to be accurate, be consistent, be responsible, and as I said, be fearless in getting the story.
And learn how to tell stories.
Yes, that's the
You're
other
not
thing.
the story. Learn how to tell a story.
Yeah.
Learn how to do an interview that elicits information.
I know.
It doesn't just, I can't tell you, and I'm still in, I work for a radio station, a news station, still in LA. And I'm appalled by, so I don't watch TV news much anymore at all.
It's unwatchable. Right.
But I have to listen to Us. And I won't say the station name because if they ever found this, but no one asks a question to elicit an answer, because the questions become a showcase for the reporter who thinks he or she is seeming smart. And I've taught a couple classes interviewing, and I've said, don't be afraid to be Columbo, because what you want, and they don't know who Columbo is or was, but you want them to answer and fill in the gaps. You're not trying to show them you're smart. I'll give you an example for someone that I work with who was doing an interview with, it's an easy interview. Mike Love of the Beach Boys was about to do a concert. And so we had him on the air. And this guy says, swear to God, music has always been very important in my life. He goes, my whole life. He said, from a very young age, I've loved music. He goes, and my father introduced me to classical music when I was very young. And then there were all other kinds of music that I learned about and grew to love. And it's always been really important to me. I lost my father a few weeks ago.
This is the interviewer?
The
This is the reporter?
Right. Explodes and goes, ask a fucking question. That literally was what he said. I remember it virtually word for word.
When I would do interviews, and I probably did many, many thousands of them in my career, I never used notes. And people would say, how do you do that? How do you have, I can talk to somebody without any notes? And I said, well, because all of my questions come from the person's answer. It's a conversation.
And they don't, and oftentimes they don't listen now. So they're so busy thinking of the next question,
right,
or how I look in the lighting,
right,
that when the guy says, and that's why I killed my wife, then they move on to something totally unrelated.
The next question that's on their list instead of listening. I just hope that some of the excellence of the past years finds its way into the new crop of journalists doing this incredibly sacred work, because that's how I think about it. And that's how we were taught in the 70s when we started, how to do this work and what our purpose was. And our purpose was to tell the truth as best we can, find out what's going on in your community and tell those stories. This is television. Write to the pictures, and don't write if you don't have to. So we were taught early on, it's not about you. It is not about you. So,
and don't compete with the pictures, which I see a lot of people doing, because all of us in that room would have, our goal was to find a powerful image. It wasn't to turn a phrase.
No, but we did. We learned how to write, Elaine.
Images first.
You were a great writer. You were a great writer. And I still remember the opening line to your piece. What is this?
I remember opening lines to your pieces.
Yeah, I remember the opening line to one of your pieces. In a city big and tall.
No, tough.
Tough. In a city big. This city is even tougher. Something like that. Wasn't that right?
That was the Lenny Wilkins
Lenny
documentary
Wilkins. Yes.
when we went
former-
back to Bed-Stuy.
Yeah.
But you did, you could tell we were sort of a fan club of each other. You did the story about the people fighting to keep their possum,
Oh, Rocky Raccoon.
Rocky Raccoon.
Yeah, he was on trial. These people
And-
wanted to, the Fish and Wildlife wanted to take this pet raccoon from this little couple.
Because
in
there was this
Eatonville.
ordinance that it was a wild animal.
It was a wild animal, right?
And Julie had this shot of their the front of their farm, their mailbox, and the mountain was out that day. So the mountain was in the background. And your opening line was, "The farmer family is well named." Do you remember that?
I forgot about it until you just mentioned it.
Yeah.
Thank you, the farmer. Yeah, that was their name. Oh my
But
God.
you know, the shot was great. The line was simple. The union was perfect. And I think, I know in the years I did news magazines and I was always on the road, you know, the best times were going out with a photographer and having a little contest about, okay, I don't have an opening shot and it needs to be a wide shot, expansive, maybe a pan. And it was every morning we would go out and look for it. And we finally did on the last day, saw the perfect shot. And there isn't much better than that when you're doing television.
Right.
I think that's the big reward, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So writing to the pictures was a great joy. And when the photographers were happy with us, it didn't get better than that. And by the way, they did finally hire female photographers, female video journalists in the early 80s.
Mary McCormick was
one of the first, and I worked with her often. And I remember Diana Wilmar, brilliant photographer.
Yeah.
So we made progress, and it was an honor, despite some of the challenges, to be among the first girls in the business.